give a brief introduction for those of you the first time here. The Seattle Gnostic Center. It is a home, but it's also a center. And we occasionally have public talks, public meetings on different topics. This being music. So some of you may have come interested in music, some healing, some Gnosticism. So we'll begin with Gnosticism and what Gnosis is. Gnosis is a Greek word, and it means knowledge. But it's a particular type of knowledge. It's not just a knowledge of intellectual concepts and ideas, though a lot of concepts and ideas and things have been written about Gnosis. It's not just an emotional knowledge, though it has the ability of inspiring. It's the knowledge of direct experience. It's direct mystical experience. And that might seem like a little paradoxical. I saw some postings online talking about, direct experience and mystical. Those don't go together, but in reality, they do. They do. They coincide on one common point, and that common point is the individual or the consciousness. Gnosis is a knowledge that is acquired only through directly experiencing something. The analogy that's often used is we can hear a lot about fire. We can see fire. We can feel the warmth. But we really don't know the capacity of fire until we actually touch it, if we were to actually touch it. And I think many of us have moments in childhood where we came in contact with something and it seared into our awareness, into our memory. Oh, don't go near the stove, or sometimes don't go on the street, because we had that intense rush of transformational knowledge that came in and communicated to us and imprinted in our memory. And through extreme situations is one way to acquire real knowledge, real gnosis. But intensity of an experience is one extreme. But also the ability to bring a stronger level of presence or consciousness to an experience also allows us to extract the gnosis or the knowledge of the direct experience. This takes place when an experience, a sensation, an impression, comes in direct contact with the consciousness and makes a transformation. And here at the school, we talk about consciousness, and generally we understand consciousness. We think we're here, we're listening, we're present, we're conscious. But as we'll talk about a little bit, that there are levels of consciousness, and there's aspects of the consciousness that operate in a mechanical sense or conditioned. Just like the example of the fire, we have other examples in our consciousness of moments where things have happened, things have hurt us, things have upset us, things have excited us, things have brought us extreme pleasure, and it conditions the consciousness in a way that desires created for those experiences to either happen again or not happen again. And those comparisons, those contrasts, those contradictions in things that we wish to do, but we may be held back by things that we don't want to experience, some type of suffering. Like a great example is a musical instrument. Let's bring it back to music. On that topic, how many people here play a musical instrument or have touched, played with a musical instrument? Because music is really just vibration. Goethe said that music is frozen geometry. Geometry is frozen music. I mean, I was trying to, I was like, okay, yes. And for some of us that remember the old cassette decks, tape players, right, where we actually had matter, iron, on a piece of tape, actual matter that was moved across a magnet while waves are imposed upon it. And if you were to look at that under a microscope, you would see that it actually produces geometric shapes. So that when that element, that matter, that iron is passed back across a magnetic head, it then plays it backwards and produces sound waves according to that geometry. There's some amazing, and this topic is so vast and so beautiful, which is often the case when I begin to put together a class. It's really a matter of what I'm not going to say. And sometimes I'm not 100% sure what I'm not going to say when I get up here. So we'll see where it goes. But so I'm going to continue to point to the internet, to YouTube, to things of those nature for you to look at some of the things that I'll just touch on, because we want to have an experiential class tonight. So we're going to use music and some other forms of music, vibration, sound to produce, to experiment with, to listen to. But if one were to go on to YouTube, you can see, and I'll show you one of these, just a slide which doesn't really express it, experiments that are done where sound is put onto a plate with lycopodium powder or different types of material or matter, so that it reproduces visually, organizes visually in the vibration that's being imposed. There's also some really wonderful experiments and images and videos done with using sound and vibration on water as it's coming out of the spigot. Has anyone ever seen those? Those are amazing. So we can now verify and prove that music is geometry. And so I point you to the YouTube to look at some of these things, to explore. And on that topic, this school is an initiatic school. And in the past, all higher education was considered to be initiatic. You are moving from one level of comprehension and understanding. For instance, an easy way to look at this, that in past, ancient times, I'm going to talk about ancient times in unique periods, particularly around ancient Greece. I call it ancient. In the Gnostic perspective, a couple thousand years really isn't ancient, but it's pretty old, But in ancient Greece, the relationship, the understanding that physical phenomena had a noumena behind it that they denoted as the gods, and that each action that took place, each natural manifestation of something, was a visible, tangible relationship to a divine, invisible principle that they called the gods. And we, in our modern mind, look back and think those poor people really, they didn't understand. But the more we go inside of ourselves and the more we really look, it was just a language to communicate something, to communicate that there are divine intelligences. Because wherever there's geometry, wherever there's structure, wherever there's creation, there's intelligence. There's intelligence behind that. But what was understood in time for those that really wanted to not only believe in the gods and the forces of the gods and just believe in elements and use those elements to communicate ideas that went beyond like basic understanding, then there would be initiatic schools of higher learning. And we'll talk about a little bit about the Pythagorean school, which is kind of an interesting thing because in ancient times, like in modern times, initiatic schools operate as a brotherhood, sisterhood, personhood, a connection, so that a lot of the things that we attribute, for instance, to Pythagoras weren't necessarily Pythagoras himself, but came from the Pythagorean school, that they were working to verify, to inspire, to communicate, and then teach and learn. Teach and learn. It's a continual process. So what has emerged from that now, just like many things in life, they become more material, more dense, more separated from the divine nature, so that now the school system, the process of education is very, very much divorced from the spiritual origins that it had, because all learning and understanding was seen as a relationship of connection, of receiving gnosis or knowledge from some mystical comprehension, so that not just intellectual pursuits and emotional pursuits and verifications. Often the verifications and the formulas came after to explain things that were being experienced internally, mystically. Direct connection. We have many examples of spiritual teachers and beings communicating directly with divinity. And having had that communion, or that real intimate connection, they're completely transformed. And then out of that transformation, they begin to share their experience. And then more than just sharing the experience and the formulas, where the matter takes that and says, oh, we're going to take this science, this understanding, and throw away the mumbo jumbo mystical stuff, because that doesn't really apply. It's really the material thing that matters. And so in doing so, what we are left with is really a shell of what the real truth is, because in those esoteric schools and those esoteric orders, we're not just the verifications and the communications and the written things, because they were in esoteric schools, meaning not everybody got in. Didn't mean that everybody couldn't get in, but in order to get in, one had to fulfill certain criteria. And the first begins with a deep longing to know, to really go beyond the concepts and ideas that we have, such as the gods, and get into what was really, really happening. And so that would be the teachings on the phenomena, and the noumena behind that would be the initiatic part, or the esoteric part. There was a mesoteric part where people would communicate like we're doing now. And then there was an exoteric part that was just completely open to public, to everyone. But always, as the knowledge went deeper, the more sacred it became, and the more longing to hold on to it. So that in those esoteric schools, we're not just the knowledge, but also the means to experience for oneself that knowledge. It's not just, look at the board, look at this picture, this is what God looks like, this is what geometry is. No, they were given, for instance, in the Pythagorean school, they had a very interesting way of going about studying with new initiates. They would bring them in, and they would put them in a separate them from the outside, and they would give them a symbol like a circle or a triangle or a square, and they would be left there hours, sometimes days, until a breakthrough would come, and they would get the individual and they bring them out into sort of an arena where all the mesoteric or the other level initiates would stand there and ask them questions about what they experienced, to prove, to verify that not only did they have a rudimentary understanding of what they were experiencing, but they had some knowledge that they could have only gotten through direct mystical connection. And so the initiatic process was the process of higher learning. And like we've given a class on health and spirituality. We talked about Hippocrates and Hippocrates, Hippocrates, and in the Hippocratic Oath, it talks about teaching freely, not charging. It talks about a lot of things that really go against our ideas of what the medicinal institutions are today. And it actually begins with a vow and an oath of honor to the gods. Of course, that part is not in our current Hippocratic Oath. So, this is also an initiatic school. It's also an esoteric school. This is the exoteric part of it, the public part, that we have meetings on other nights. And if individuals wish to really go deeper into the study of not just gnosis in the relationship of phenomena, but gnosis in the relationship of self-gnosis, self-knowledge. Because as was written on the Oracle of Delphi, man, know thyself, and you shall know the universe and its gods by knowing ourselves, which gives us a very powerful tool. It means that nobody else can keep that knowledge from us. No great conspiracy, no great, changing. And as if we start to study, and I don't know if we've studied music and musicology and some of the, let's say, esoteric elements of music, there's beliefs and ideas that the tuning system was intentionally changed in the Nazi era.
44-1?
Yeah, exactly. But that's all very good. That's all good and fine. That may be, maybe not be the actual reasons why it was done. But the real truth is, the real knowledge, the real gnosis cannot be hidden. Because we have to understand when we're talking about things like music and the ability to affect, as Pythagoras understood, to affect the psyche and the individual through music, using music to heal, as well as other elements, we have to realize that we're only generally speaking about one aspect of reality. And in Gnosis, we speak often about three realities. The physical reality that we're all here a part of. And so when we're talking about physical vibration and music, and even emotion and mental relationship, those are still more or less physical realities. Beyond that, there's a psychological reality, and our psychology is actually the more real to us than the physical. For instance, phobias are a great example of that. I have a granddaughter. We have a granddaughter. She used to be very intrigued and curious about insects and spiders, but somewhere along the line, it shifted, and she is just freaked out about it. And we all, I think, most people have a little bit of fear of spiders for some reason, but in the animal world, animal logic pervades, because I'm bigger than you. There's no reason for me to be afraid of you. But our psychology dictates a state of being that for us is more real. Tell somebody that has a phobia of spiders to hold one in their hand and tell them that what they're experiencing isn't real. That phobia is very real. And I think we all have our own relationships. Cheese is one of mine. I really don't like cheese a lot. I don't. I wouldn't call it a phobia. Would you call it a phobia?
You're telling them your kryptonite.
I'm telling you kryptonite. So don't do any of that. You put the Velveeta slices in your pockets and come up to me and talk, try and fool me. It's like, oh, I'm feeling a little woozy. What's going on? Oh. So anyway, in higher education, they had what was called the 7 liberal arts. And at the pyramid, and you can't really see it in this, but there's 7 levels of learning, and it's very beautiful. There's a lot that could be understood from ancient art. But I'll just break it down very quickly. At the top 3 were called the trivium, and it related to the word. Grammar, which was the art of the written word. Rhetoric, which is the art of the spoken word or language, logic, which was the art of reason or organization of the word, and then the quadrivium, which were the lower four parts which dealt with numbers. And most of the ancients had a deep reverence for numbers. Why we have so much information about math? Because it was understood that numbers have a personality. Numbers have a force, a form, an energy. And that no better can we see this cultivated in the Tarot. If we've worked with the Tarot or studied with the Tarot, it's really a relationship of the science of numbers. We'll talk a little bit about the Tree of Life and the Kabbalah, which is also a science of numbers. Which music is also a science of numbers, because in this quadrivium, the first is arithmetic, which is the number in itself. Geometry, which was the number in space, and music or harmonics or tuning theory was number in time, and then astronomy or cosmology, or which was linked with astrology back then, which was the number in space and time. So the understanding of music and harmony was directly related to an aspect of higher understanding. And actually, we know from the Gnostic writings, from the modern Gnostic writings, the Gnostic master Samael Aun Weor speaks about ancient. When I say ancient, I'm meaning, 3,000, 8,000, 12,000, hundreds of thousands of millions of years, which is an interesting concept. But in ancient times, humanities had a capacity that was different than now, and the remnants of that were in the ancient Americas and in some of the Indian relationships, the East Indian and Asian elements, but more untouched for a longer period of time in Mesoamerica and the Americas, and that they understood that they didn't really have a word for singing, because that was really like talking, a form of talking, and everybody sung and everybody danced. And that the way that they communicate was through song and dance. The ability to communicate, which is really impactful because it engages not just the mind, but the emotions and the body. And having those three elements together impacts the consciousness in a way that we get a more three-dimensional relationship to learning, to memory. I mean, we can do this ourselves by writing something down. Actually engages another dimension to learning that helps us to remember. Do that as an experiment. You want to remember something, write it down and feel yourself, visualize yourself writing it down. And then forget about it for a week or two. And then, hey, what was that thing I wrote down? And see if you don't get an image. Which brings me to a very important point. An instrument. Playing a musical instrument is a very three-dimensional, engaging experience, because obviously you're using your fingers, or there's a lot of different instruments out there, but usually it's fingers in some way, breath, breathing, and emotion, because it's uplifting or saddening. And then we engage the intellect and the mind too, because we're reading or we're remembering. So the very act of playing an instrument really activates the consciousness at a deeper level. So I highly recommend anybody that wants to really push themselves to develop, do things that involve those three aspects simultaneously. And even if you just had a guitar and just had a metronome going and just moved your fingers in relation and create a pattern, it really has a profound effect on the consciousness, because we're expanding ourselves by experiencing in three dimensions. And music in itself has an amazing power beyond us playing it in listening. It has the ability to transform a mood, a state. And I contemplated doing more of this, more interactive stuff, but playing different types of music, because there's certain types of music that it's almost impossible to be unhappy while you're listening to it. Certain instruments, like the ukulele, very happy instrument. It's not one of those instruments, you don't hear a lot of dirges played on the ukulele that I know of. But there's also certain types of music that's very difficult to feel good about, to feel good with. But music has a duality to it. And again, it has a relationship to the consciousness. First, the consciousness of the individual that made the music, that they put that awareness, that state that they had into the music, put the emotion, because it's not just skill. It's an art, which means because we could go and you can Google in your Google machine MIDI music. And you can hear music that's completely composed or at least performed by a computer, by just dot, 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 putting some dots in there. And it plays it back. Because when we look at musical, it's just dots that have certain periods of length in different range and pitch. But the difference between an impactful, transformative music is not just in the intensity and the skill. And like some of the music today, and I don't want to isolate or upset anybody. We were talking a little bit about some dark music, or at least dark musicians that intentionally feel dark and want people to feel dark. There's particular types of music that maybe intellectually is so packed and put together, you cannot resist going, wow, that's intense. But you can notice when listening to it how it makes your consciousness feel, how it makes your heart feel, how it makes your body feel over time. And so the first component of the healing part of music that I would like to put forth is the consciousness that's put into it, right? But the consciousness of the listener and what you take out of it. So the first component of the healing power of music is finding something that you enjoy, that inspires you, and listen to it intentionally. That's going to be one of our exercises. It's a little interesting because, we're going to have a meeting here in public, and if you want to come back in a month or so in October
26th,
there's some flyers back there. We're going to talk about the process of death and Halloween. But some of us come back, we're able to come back weekly, and we give exercises, and then we share our experiences with the exercises. But one exercise that I'm going to give is to find something, a music that inspires you, and listen to it intentionally to change your state. Does anyone do that? Okay, good. I'm not just being like, wow, listen to music to feel different. Because music has that power. Music has the power. So the most important part, I think, of the music is to find something that inspires you. Because most music is created through an inspiration to affect something, to produce something. So it's not just that intensity of skill. The real impactful music is through a psychology or an emotion that person producing the music. And even through an instrument, it's amazing when someone is really feeling it. You feel the presence through that. And one of the things that I do often is I find music that I like and I listen to, and I don't, from some Gnostic points of view, people would think, well, you should only listen to classical music, only put together music this way. I don't subscribe to that. We have to. There is certain geometry and intention in that certain classical musics, but you have to find something that inspires you and that you feel, and that when you're listening to it, you're feeling the music go through you, and with it stimulating and activating parts of yourself. So that what I often do is, because I like to stay as connected as I can to the divine during the day. When I'm listening to music, a love song, I think of it as a love song to God. If I'm hearing certain songs, and there are certain songs that are difficult to do, but certain songs that are talking about pain or difficulties that they've had, then I think of it as things that mistakes I've felt or done, or lower states of consciousness, and feel that to try to come through that. So music has a great power from that, and it's always been it has a duality, like I said, the level of consciousness that's put in and the level of consciousness that's extracting it. Because rhythm has the capacity mechanically to put us to sleep, to hypnotize us, and it also has the power to wake us up, to rejuvenate us. And so sometimes you watch bands playing or people in the crowd and they're just doing this, and you can see that there's a certain level of hypnotism going on. And in that hypnotism, a certain level of sleep and a certain level of vibration that can be communicated intentionally or unintentionally to people to make them feel. And there was a huge thing in my day about backwards masking and some of the things that and not just backwards masking, but hidden messages in the music. There was a great court case against Judas Priest, that people that committed, a couple of kids that committed suicide, that were listening to this music over and over, and they felt that there was subliminal messages that said, just do it. It was telling the kids to kill themselves. So whether intentionally or unintentionally, the consciousness that I bring to what I'm listening to, if I'm down and I'm listening to something that's darker, it's going to magnify that and produce, it's going to affect that. But that's the duality of music. And there's continually been changes in society and culture, and on the forefront of those changes was music. Every movement has a song. I mean, now you know that when politicians come out, it's usually a big deal. It seems this to be common. This has probably always been this way. Up here in the Northwest, a little more liberal, some of the bands that are liberal really take offense to right-wing people using their music. And so that it happens almost every election I've seen. It seems like it's happened, right? You've seen that. We don't want to be associated with that. But politicians know. I want to hypnotize, in a way, just a message, an idea into the collective consciousness of people, to associate myself with this element. So there's always been on the forefront of change and culture, music. And there's always been struggles in relation to that. It's interesting, even in the time of Martin Luther and the Reformation, the whole quote actually is, I don't have the whole quote here. Oh well. But he talks about the cranks that would say that music is of the devil. His belief. And he said, next to the word of God, the noble art of music is the greatest treasure in the world. When you look around for music and quotes, you start to see a lot of people that are connected with music in ways that we didn't realize, you know? And that there was always certain norms that were challenged when new music and new ideas came out, and usually new fashions and new ways of representing and saying things that we wouldn't have said 100 years ago or 20 years ago. I remember when I was young, my first impact, I was watching, back when Gary Busey was semi-normal, he was just awkward, the Buddy Holly story. And it was a big deal. He wanted to be a rock and roller. And there was a big deal about, the devil and people shaking the hips, and Elvis Presley and shaking the hips. But think back in time and think of the different changes that we've seen. Usually it's associated with a song or a music, certain movements, certain revolutions. Like, for instance, one of the most famous images of the revolution is musicians leading the forefront or rising up out. I remember the story of Francis Scott Key. You know that story? Writing the Star Spangled Banner, thinking that America was going to fall. I think that was the War of 1812, though, where British. I don't know if we probably know this, realize it, that actually marched and burnt the White House down to the ground. Imagine that happening now. It's weird, but the music that came out of that, to inspire, to connect, to bring together, to affect one another. But now there's studies shown that there's actually a healing component to music. It has a means to actually affect the brain. And we're going to talk about this in a couple of ways. But the first is, and this is kind of a staggering statistic, sometimes I hear these statistics and I'm like, is that true? Can that be true? That about 26% of the demographic that was between 18 and older, about 1 in 4 adults, suffer from some form of mental disorder at a certain point or time in a year. So it was over a year. And so we're starting to look as a people and as a culture, trying to find ways to help do that. And music has been one of the techniques that they're looking at. And not only to affect a state and bring about a different sense of being, but actually they're seeing that it's actually creating neurogenesis and creating new neurons in the brain. And there's studies doing that's related to they call it the Mozart effect, but just listening to certain classical masters in music and having people do things while they're listening to it, and they see that their comprehension and their knowledge and their awareness is stronger in relation to this. And that it actually creates the neurotransmitter dopamine in the system that is also created when many of the fulfillments are done in relation to eating, to sex, to all of these big drives that produce this or are in relation to this inrush of dopamine, that music has that capacity, that science is starting to put music in the category of something that one really needs, one really wants, that it's in our fiber. And that, as I started to say before, not just the ancient people of this world here, but before that the ancient peoples, every word that was spoken was considered a song. Because if we see everything as divine, then that means every word and everything we have to communicate that is a love song to the divine in some sense. And in ancient times, the postures and every movement was to transform a certain amount of energy, a certain formation. And that makes a lot of sense when we understand that sound is geometry. That when we take a certain posture, a geometric form, we are resonating or vibrating with that particular type of energy. We're attracting it. Because the science of music is very wonderful as we start to understand the relationship of the octaves, that when one note of a pitch is struck through sympathy, it vibrates that same note on the octave above and below. And the way the octave works is in relation to vibration. That when you take a string, like a guitar string or anything of any size has a vibration, that when you cut it in half, the vibrations double, and that's considered the octave, and it goes up. And so Pythagoras spoke about this, and I don't know if you've heard the sort of the Western scale that we have now kind of was codified and put, he gets a lot of credit in that. And it was understood that he was walking through the town and he heard hammering in a blacksmith. And he noticed that the pitch, well, we all notice this, but thinking profoundly, he noticed that the pitch of the metal that was being hit changed in relation to the size. And so he did some experiments, and he took strings and strung them out, metal wire, and tried to get them equal. And then he would put a weight at one end. And he noticed that if he doubled the weight, the vibrations sped up accordingly. And he was able to create different relationships in that way. And so there's a lot, and if we were going to do a course on this, we would go into a lot more on the relationship of sound and vibration and harmony. Something very interesting about a note is that a note by itself, a sound, cannot be in harmony. There is no completely absolute disharmonious sound. It is only harmonious or discordant in relationship to something else. That's very important, because that starts to get us, if we can take the leap from the physical realm into that psychological realm. Because life is an experience of relationships. And as we said, our psychological relationships are stronger in us than our physical relationships. And then we can see this in the way that, for instance, if you get a shot, imagine that. I'm going to do a thought experiment. Some people, I was going to see if anybody was going to squinch, thinking about a needle going in. I had a friend that was studying to be a phlebotomist, which is a blood drawer, and he used to like to practice. He needed to practice, and so practice and just try to be as conscious as you can and just sit there and watch the needle go in.
Some people really don't like it.
I know. I was watching. I'm not seeing it. Some people are like, well, I want to see thinking about it. But anyway, so mathematically, needle, the resistance of the skin, it's almost the same in each person. Yet some people experience excruciating pain. Relative to the amount of desire they have against that thing. So the relationship of notes are very important. And so, because that tells us, if we have a note, a core, like a note is rung here on this pitch, that it's going to sympathetically vibrate above and below and same around. So if we're attuned to ourselves being geometric, and we'll look at how it even goes deeper, because we're composed primarily of water, and water is a mineral in a sense. It has minerals in it, components in it, that is then matter and geometry, and that when water freezes, it takes geometric forms. When the vibration of the water slows down so that it no longer moves, and I'll show you, if there's time, some of the experiments that use the relationship of word and thought and prayer on water to see it affect the geometry of the water. So that in our lives, the vibration of the psychologies of those around us also affect our psychology, which means my psychology, the vibration of my thinking and feeling, is also affecting others around me. So that's one of the great keys of what we call the path of initiation. Because one of the components of that path of initiation is the ordeal, or the trial, or the proof, or the verification of the harmony that we have. If we say, I have this particular virtue, or I have this particular understanding, then sympathetically that is going to attract in space, the number in space and time around me, the similar vibration in different scale, different pitch. And then I can see, if I'm attuned, whether I'm harmonious with that in nature inside of myself, or whether I'm discordant. For instance, we can say, sit in a room and pray, love, 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 love. I'm an all-loving being, I'm all-loving being. And then I step outside for one instant, and I hear somebody yell something at me, and I realize that idea that I had of me being a loving being went out the window because I got identified in relationship to an event. That harmony that I believed that I had, when tested in reality, turned out not to be harmonious. That actually the vibration of the thing outside caused me to vibrate that way. So to move from the physical relationship to the psychological can actually help us to understand the third reality, which is the esoteric, or the deeper spiritual or inner reality. And this was communicated by Pythagoras, and then many in the times of the Renaissance and the different eras of expression, the alchemists began to experiment in deeper ways and communicate as well. One such being Robert Flood took this idea of the monochord, or this relationship of creation, as a life being one giant string that's vibrating. And then on that string are the different octaves. I'll show you another adaptation of this and speak about it a little bit. But he said, in relation to the monochord, this one chord, mono, if struck in the more spiritual part, the monochord will give eternal life. If in the more material part, it will give transitory life. So the individual being at the base of that, and so this great monochord, and I'll communicate, it conveys two octaves that are broken in the center. At the base here this is the symbol for earth, terra, and then beyond that, water, air, and fire, and the notes, A, B, C. And it's very interesting because we're going to see that there's a relationship to the law of three in relation to music, but in relation to psychology, but also in the relationship to spirituality. Like, for instance, and we'll show it later, if you look at this tree of life, at the top is a triangle. Three spheres. At the head of the Christian theogony is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that would be the extreme three of the octave of this monochord, of the second part of the monochord. But I'll show how the relationship of the psychological connection with the musical scale, and how it was communicated and used in the ancient times to affect the consciousness, and how we, needing to remember that first tonic note, which is the first tonal note of the scale, because that first note of the scale is going to dictate if the subsequent notes are in harmony or in discordance. The problem is, for most of us in our life, psychologically speaking, we don't have a common tonal note. We're not operating in a particular key that we're conscious of. So we're not aware of what's discordant or harmonious in our lives. That's why we have difficulties and mistakes and problems, because we forget what key we're in. And if you've ever played music and you sit down with some musicians, that's the first thing that needs to be understood. What key are we in, so that I can know if my note is going to relatively be harmonious or discordant. To not know the key, to not know what the root note is, then we're not going to know what our point of orientation is. But, and then back to the tarots I spoke about before, something very interesting, that the divisions of the string begin with water, air, and fire. Earth is the baseline, the point, which is considered to be the starting point of the octave that has its center point. This would be the first G. There's a G here in the center of the sun that has then its counterpoint in divine nature and being tuned slowly by the hand of God. That this relationship, like in the tarot, like also that's based on the Hebraic language, the Hebraic alphabet, the 22 arcana of the tarot, or the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, that represent laws that we find in nature, but also similar laws of music, based upon the one, which is the totality of everything, the three, which are the three prime elements, the seven, which are the seven planets, and the 12, which are the 12 zodiacal signs. And it's said that in the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, that God speaks creation through the alphabet. And that the element earth is not part of one of the elements, because it's spoken to the consciousness. And that I am the element earth. And so when we're studying mystical traditions and esoteric writings, whenever the earth is spoken of, generally it means you. It means me. So when we're talking about the planet Earth and the apocalypse and all these different things, it's speaking about you, me. It's speaking about a lot of things, but as you see in relation to the octave, it has different meanings relative to where our attention is. Because the relationship of the tarot or the path is to affect the philosophical earth, the individual, to form it in God's image. And so the three primary elements, or the three letters, the Aleph, Mem, and Shin, the three maternals in the creation, represent water, air, and fire. But in a musical scale, and we'll show this in a moment, that's very important. The first three notes are very important in a musical scale of the natural major scale, because the relationship of those notes, something has to happen in order for a natural harmonic transition from the third note to the fourth note. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But I just want to point that it shows it this way on this: the water, the air, and the fire, which are elements of purification in the initiatic process, elements of verification. Is the earth true? Because we can see that this creates two great octaves, that at the center is the sun, and we've probably heard the esoteric axiom that we are a microcosm of the macrocosm, which means we are a solar system in miniature. And that the base represents the earth, but there's another sub-octave, which is the human being on that earth. that my objective in the process of initiation is to transform and become a real terrestrial body, or an Adam Kadmon, a spirit injected, infused in the human being. And that there's a direct connection from the absolute creation to the finite creation. And that the stages move in this way. That there are three great initiations that take place to move. To move beyond the human animal individual that we are into a divine or angelic individual. And then after that process is done, there's three more steps to get to the solar individual. And then there are three more steps to get to the cosmic, or to the zodiacal relationship. Because in that path of the Tarot, the 22 arcana, the 3, the 7, which is the musical scale, which relates to the 7 visible planets, the 7 days of the week, and the 12 zodiacal signs. 12 plus 7 plus 3 is 22. So there we have a beautiful representation of creation, of the cosmos, and we also have that relationship to the music that we use. Because to make a harmonious chord, a triad, we usually say it's in 3 parts, 3 notes. I'll show versions of chords visually. That the harmonious division of the scale is in 7 on the Western. It could be done differently, but it sounds different, obviously. 7 harmonious steps. But a complete octave is 12 spaces. 7 harmonious and 5 ordering parts. Then 3 more great steps to leave the instrument as it is, completely. So we spoke a lot about Pythagoras, and he also communicated this very beautiful sentiment that there's geometry in the humming strings, there's music in the spacing of the spheres, and that they had a special song that they would sing at the beginning of each morning, and a special song that they would sing at the end of each day, honoring the birth of the sun, the rising of the sun. And the idea, we've probably heard of the music of the spheres, was first put together in those times in relation to Pythagoras. And what the first experiential experience that we're going to do, we've now had representations from NASA that takes the movements on the sun itself, the king star, the undulations and all of those movements, visually represents them, and then creates vibrational forms in relation to that. And then they speeds them up thousands and thousands of times so that it condenses, for instance, 40 days into a few minutes, so that the frequency gets fast enough so that we can actually hear it. And so it's called the Song of the Sun, that we can hear this interesting throbbing vibration that helps to really synchronize and organize, and something that we could do. I'm going to post this on the website. But the relationship of this vibration of the rays of the sun, the force of the sun, and the effect that it has, for instance, on water. You can do this as an experiment. You take, and you can Google and find the sound yourself, and it's advantageous every morning before you eat anything, drink water. Very good to start to flush the system. But even more advantageous is to take the sound and play it next to the water so that it sort of geometrizes the water. So I'm going to play the sound. And now, there we go. So this is a brief little interlude. Exhalation, try to completely empty your lungs. Anybody have any thoughts, feelings about that? Words to share?
Just really feel like a lot of the thoughts that were moving through my head just settled down really quietly, and my body felt very calm, and I felt my heart, but I also felt a lot of energy in the front come to the front of my brain, into this part, just naturally streaming.
I think I would agree. I felt a lot more probably third eye
Yeah.
activation as well.
Felt very inspiring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's nice to listen to just the Ave Maria at 800, slowed down 800 times. It's actually about a half hour long. I just, I don't know, but it's kind of amazing.
Yeah, that was cool. I didn't realize what you were getting into there.
I actually, there was a moment where I actually felt fear, like it was almost like part of me was out of control, and I knew it was good and safe, but like it was penetrating to a part of me that was really like deep.
Yeah.
Really deep. It almost was a little scary.
Yeah.
I feel different right now than like before I closed my eyes. And I experience the same things that she's saying.
Right. There's, and I think we could say it's sort of a haunting, and it's not just the sound, because it does touch on things, which brings something very interesting up, that we can experiment, obviously, music and feel, and there's schools of thought that you can restructure, because we are water. You can restructure by imposing vibration on the body, and there's an element of that, yes, but again, that works just with the physical. What really activates is bringing the awareness and the consciousness to it, because spirituality isn't magic, or it is magic in a sense, but it's a different type of magic. It's the magic that requires, what's the first thing a magician says before he does a trick? Okay, before that, may I have a volunteer? The first thing the magician needs is a volunteer. So we have to be that volunteer. We have to want to be different in some way. We have to want
to be inspired.
Because music has a duality. Life has a duality. We can see the negative over and over and over again. If that's what we're looking with, we'll see it. Generally, the person that goes out looking for a fight finds it. So our state, our vibration, our psyche seeks and finds things to perpetuate it. That's what desire does on its own. It seeks perpetuation. And it uses the harmony or discordance relative to its own desire to repeat over and over. And so the transcendence of those first three notes of the musical scale are very important. We'll talk about that in a moment. Anybody else want to say anything about sitting with that for a moment?
I definitely felt my heart chakra activate a lot, and I still feel it much more active now. Like, it was a whole rush in my body, and had a lot of like orange. Although that was but that was just kind of energy.
I saw with my two eyes the orange. Third eye, yeah,
exactly.
And as common was practice in monasteries and different schools, an individual would get a mantra or a vibration to work with sound that would produce an experience, and then they would come back to the master, and the master would say, and he would say to the master, I had this profound sense of well-being and peace. And the master would say, and what did you do with it? Because that's the key component, right? The vibration has the power with the consciousness to unlock parts of ourselves. But the purpose is not because to feel good for feeling good's sake, which is great. It's good to feel good. But to use that state to contrast normal lower states. The power of sound has the ability on a psychological level to break those conditions and forms. Just like in a physical level, we've seen the resonating of the crystal at a certain frequency that matches and it destroys it. And that the mantras and the prayers that were used in the different teachings throughout time are to produce states that then one can work psychologically inside of that state to liberate the consciousness that's trapped in that pit, that the keynote unlocks. And we feel that. You feel that sometimes, like, oh, this opening. And then the question is, what comes out? Fear, anger, sadness, joy. And so then we have the ability to use that same consciousness from outside, now that thing is loosed, and to get a sense of contrast between the feeling of the good and the feeling of the bad. And that's, I guess I'll talk about this now, another component of vibration and sound and the relationship of the hemispheres of the brain, but that's just the physical level. The relationships of potential or contrast in the consciousness between, for instance, the thing that I want to do. I want to love, but I get mad, I get angry, I forget, I get identified. And if I had the capacity to take this state that we produce and try to hold it, to harmonize it, to sing that silently inside of myself, to keep it going, and then allow the impressions of the world to contact me while maintaining the state, or what we say in Gnosis, the division of attention between observing and self-observing, so that I'm looking inside and outside simultaneously, that there's a mathematical formula, a potential difference between those two states that we say in most teachings, the relationship of potential. Want to exercise my highest potential. I want to incarnate, self-realize the greatest potential. But potential, what is potential? It's a difference between 2 points. I'm an electrician, so I know about potential. It's what we call voltage. It's a pressure, it's a push, it's a difference between 2 points. So in ancient times, they would use techniques to activate this potential. Now, these are Tibetan, I don't know, bells, chimes. Anyway, you've all seen these, right? Now listen. Don't take a picture. I don't want that on the internet. But these intentionally vibrate, oscillate at different frequencies. And they're made to produce because what happens, the brain rectifies between two things and feels the potential. And so generally they're made to harmonize at a difference of potential of 7.83 hertz, which is also related to the Schumann resonance, which is also related to the brain waves between alpha and theta, the deep states. So if you've heard, and here's one more thing that we're not going to show you, but you could look at, is what's called the relationship of binaural beats, which is putting a frequency in one ear and a different frequency in the other ear, and mathematically your brain synchronizes the potential, the difference between those two, and then you can set a frequency between. It's interesting. And again, all of this is fascinating, beautiful, interesting stuff, but the point is what to do with it. We don't want to leave it just in the mind and think, wow, I've got these great tools, and we sit and we just, and then we maybe get one, like they have the beer hats, maybe you have the gong hats, and you can walk around and always feel that vibration. No, the thing is to try to find that potential psychologically, the difference between a higher state of consciousness and a lower state, or a conditioned state, a state that's trapped in material gratification. Because then when I find the right octave, I can break that conditioning and free that element that may come with fear at some point. But then we go deeper. What do you do with that? What's behind the fear? And eventually we get to a piece of balance where the potential is realized and there is a balance, a harmony that's created, a freedom, that then we have real free will, the ability to be different. Right now, primarily, we're stimulated by external circumstances and not understanding our relationship to them, that the rhythm and the melody of life puts us asleep. It causes us to dance violently or to dance sadly. So the key is to not just listen to nice music, but to produce a state that I can work on the elements that are not in congruency with that state, to produce harmony, which is the balance of two forces. Harmonia, or Concordia, her name was, in the Roman tradition, was the offspring of Mars and Venus. That prior to the connection with the love of Venus, Mars, the god of war, had three sons. Deimos, Phobos, fear, Deimos, panic, and Himerios, uncontrollable desire. And that he took those children with him when he went into war. Out in front they would go. And we use that through media and all sorts of forms, producing panic, producing fear, producing intense desire. That's how commercial music, commercial jingles, commercial slogans, and all of these and different techniques that are used to put us to sleep and to keep us from wanting to go deeper inside of ourselves. So it's not that the conspiracy is that these things are happening outside. It's not that the conspiracy that this music's being created. It's that I unknowingly dance to it. That I have to take the elements, the opportunities to break and to mix that force, the strength of Mars, with the love of Venus and produce harmony. Because if I have the correct frequency to meet any circumstance harmoniously, I can break that thing. But in order to break it, I have to see it. In order to see it, I have to be conscious. So I have to continually work to not fall asleep. And that's one of the tenets of Gnosticism. It's one of the tenets of, at the core of really almost all spiritual traditions, is that not the world, but me. I am asleep. And I'm not just asleep, put there by the vibration of the world. I'm asleep, self-hypnotized to my own desires, to my own images, to my own thoughts, to my own feelings, to my own phobias, to my own relationships to the world. That I'm asleep. And that we are moving around in the world in relative harmony and discordance, but trapped in duality and relativity. Everything's revolving around me, but I'm not conscious that I'm continually bringing everything back to me. So this feedback loop continues in the harmony of the way I think and feel to bring in the world a relationship that is the same. We call that karma. The syncopation, the vibration, the harmonization with myself, the law of affinity and attraction of myself attracts my life. And I can't just change my life by changing the way I think. I need to change fundamentally my consciousness. I have to transform the way I am communicating and being communicated to in the world. I have to break the conditioning of my own psyche. And I have to do it in the same area and place it was created. So the law of karma works in a beautiful way to continue to bring me back to the places, to the elements, to the circumstances that I lost my consciousness. And if I want to end painful cycles, I have to go into them consciously. Just like in that practice, to go in and feel the fear, to feel it. Because what karma really wants in the world is the individual to feel the consequences of our actions. And if I don't feel it, if I can complain and I say, this isn't me, this isn't mine, I don't deserve this, then it keeps coming back. The musical track is like on a loop. I had this in a meditation. It was a thought, really. Sometimes I get some pretty good thoughts, sometimes some terrible thoughts. But that the movie was happening and two people were sitting here and they were listening, they were talking, and in the background music was playing. And the same song kept playing over and over and over, and they never noticed it. Until they noticed it, and then it changed. That's how our life operates. We have to notice it before it can change. We have to notice it, and then we have to stand in relation to it so that the potential difference between what is happening outside and the higher relationship, not of what I'm vibrating inside that brought this about, but this force remembering something divine, a higher ideal, a higher principle, a higher octave to break that down. So we'll go back just to a few moments in relation to this. The tree of life, which is sort of a stick figure of the universe. And that it represents the complete potential of the human individual. Just like those 22 letters of the alphabet, the Hebraic alphabet, they're encoded in these forms, that the first three prime elements relate to these three horizontal lines. Then there are 7 vertical lines and 12 diagonal lines. That makes 22 paths. But in relation to the spheres and the creation and this great divine being, outside of manifestation and what we call abstract absolute space, everything is in complete harmony, and in that harmony, balance. Because if everything is vibrating at exactly the same pitch and speed, it's as if it's not moving at all. And we say in Gnosis that relates to the world of the one law. And we can call it love, but really love is just a conditional form of that. It's truth, it's justice, it's grace, it's happiness, it's sadness, it's everything harmonized together. And we can see that as the thought of the great being that then becomes 3 in the mind of this great being. And then through the magical sphere of Dot, which is the Hebrew word for gnosis, knowledge, through the word of that great being, we have 7 lower spheres that relate to the 7 stages of the process of breaking these different psychological structures inside of ourselves. Because the planets relate to intelligences, to gods, but they also relate to aspects of our own consciousness. And that there are 7 great octaves in this universe and 7 great octaves in relation to our own human mind. So we say in this, there's 49 levels of our mind related to 7 spheres. And this being the earthly sphere. No matter what we do in this physical world, this physical reality, no matter how beautiful the music is, no matter how perfect the geometry is, no matter how magical our diet is, the best we could ever hope for is just to get through the first 7 layers of this mind. And what happens as we go through our life, hypnotized, the mind hides itself from itself. And so there's 7 great octaves that has a potential above where we are, but there's 7 great octaves that have a relationship below where we are. And that's the wonderful thing about music. I see a note vibrating here, but my spectrum of vision and sound cannot tell if it's being stimulated from a note on a superior octave or a note on an inferior octave. All I know is this is happening here and now. So in order to understand that, I have to expand my awareness and observe, notice, why is this thing vibrating? Why is this song playing in my mind? Why is this psychological song that I'm singing? And how many times have I sung it? Why am I singing it? Because to undo this, we have to return as it is back to unity, back to harmony. And in the musical relationship and the laws of spiritual forces, 1 represents unity, 3 is the law of creation, 7 is the law that organizes that creation, and 12 is the law that crystallizes or represents the completion. That's why all of the teachings on the most further periphery relate to the 12, like the zodiacal signs, which were called the fixed stars, the 12 apostles, the 12 tribes, the 12 knights of the round table. We can find it, the 12 gods of Olympus, over and over and over, because in the human.
12 man.
Had to get it in there. Come on.
Go Hawks. Okay. That, I appreciate that. Because these are elements of our own psyche played out through time and space. Continually, externally living and telling these stories, but having to try to find these things inside of ourselves. So music is a great way to represent this. I don't know, of the instruments that people play, piano, I'm using piano because it's the most clean, clear, consistent way to look. It's set in the around the C major scale. So here, as I said, we have 12 parts, 12 notes, and this represents 1 octave. This is middle C, C below that, and it just repeats over and over. And the beauty of the piano is it's orchestrated so that to do the harmonious musical scale in C major, you just go white key to white key. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7. And in that, there are 5 structural notes, making the 12. But to harmoniously move through this, there's something very interesting, because we've probably, I don't know, if you haven't played the piano, you probably look at it, it's just black and white, black and white, black and white. You know, it seems like there's an order, but I push these keys and blah, 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 blah. But how it relates to the notes of the musical scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, re, mi, on and on and on. But like I said before, There's something very critical that's missing between mi and fa and si and the next do, or the octave, the eighth of the scale. There's no structural, inherent, natural phenomenon to perpetuate or balance that movement. So psychologically speaking, nature doesn't provide us the step to move from mi to fa. Well, I'll show you. We'll go back to that. So, and I showed on the piano, you can see it very clearly. Of lesser importance now, because I'm going to talk about this, but we'll just go through the relationship of the chords. A chord, or a triad, is made up of the first note in the major chords, the first note of the scale, the third note, and the fifth note. So a little key, if you want to play piano for a moment, you want to do a beautiful chord, take the C and just alternate, bing, bing, and play those three notes together. It makes a nice flow. But you go and move all the way down and just move those three. It's a little weird. The funny thing on guitar, if you play guitar, the patterns are exactly the same as you move them. In the piano, you have to change because you only get one set of order of the black keys and the white keys. So I'm just going through the chords. Let's get to the very interesting relationship of this musical scale of the octaves, psychologically speaking. Because the law of three creates, which means any creation, anything in life, physical or psychological and subsequently spiritual, it has those three primary forces in relationship to it. For instance, if we take fruit, every fruit more or less has the skin, the meat, and the seed. We, as we talked about, have an intellectual mind, an emotional mind, and an active mind. Everything that happens in this phenomenal world is a composite of an active force, a resistive force, and a result of those two forces. So this comes back to how do we think, feel, and act? Because we've said this before, not everyone's heard this, but every thought, feeling, and action produces a consequence, has an effect. So if I'm thinking let's just give the example of the diet, which is really powerful because we can all experience this or have experienced at one point or another. I say, I will not eat dessert because whatever the reason is. That becomes the first force. I eat my meal and then I smell the desserts as the cart comes by. The second force, the resistance. If I don't remember my aim, my initial impetus, and I don't know if any of you have ever done this. Have you ever done something mechanically where you think, I'm not going to do this anymore, and then automatically, boom, you do it. And then you're like, oh, wait, I wasn't supposed to be doing that. Because we forget ourselves. We forget our aim. We don't have a solar system with the sun at the center. The planets, the forces outside are driving all of these situations so that we forget ourselves. We forget, I want to be conscious, but I want to be loving, and this person upsets me. So what happens is I get a force in nature. Whenever I say I wish to do this, it produces a consequence in nature as a result of my want. And the combination of the first force and the second force produces a result that I either triumph and don't eat the dessert, or if I don't remember, I eat the dessert and I go back to dough again. Now, more importantly, psychologically, we are setting our intention out continually. And every intention, every thought, feeling, and action produces a consequence, which is in relation to my first action that I perceive as opposition or an obstacle or a problem or resistance. And if I identify myself more with life as a problem or an obstacle, then the result is going to be entropy and inertia pulls me back down and I don't succeed in relation to my want. But if I remember with enough force, like the force of Mars, with enough force, like the force of love, that this is what I want to be different, then that force becomes stronger than the resistance, and the result becomes different. And that produces, or has the capacity for us to produce with our consciousness, a shock that allows us to move forward in our octave. This is happening unconsciously in everything that we're doing. There's a sensation, which becomes an action, an active force. We make a representation to it. I either like it or I don't like it. And then it becomes a result, a concept about myself. A psychological song that I sing. I can't do that. I shouldn't do that. I don't like that. I don't want that. And I go through, and unfortunately, these octaves in my psyche don't even allow me to have the access to the deep levels of my likes and dislikes. They get vibrated down to more denser elements, and they're like the rocks at the bottom of the ocean, of the river, moving the river, and I'm on the surface continually being moved, trying to deal with situations that actually have their cause and their origin deep inside of my psyche. That the notes deep in my psyche are vibrating and producing the vibration in my life. But if I can remember and produce a conscious shock towards the thing that I really wish to accomplish by remembering, in Gnosis we say remembering our being, our spirit, thinking of the spiritual element, which, oddly enough, isn't that obvious. But what we do is produce a space to at least not identify with the resistance. And that allows a space in which the elements can produce, to create themselves, because we create a third force between myself, my environment, and a space, allowing for a new element to arise, which we call gnosis, or comprehension, or an actualization of the potential. That is the difference between a cacophony, I didn't know I was going to say that word, but I like it, a cacophony or a symphony. What is the difference? It is space in between the notes. I need to affect the space with my consciousness. I might not know what the right action is, but I can sense the vibration of the wrong action. And through the process of initiation at certain levels, that these vibrations inside of me are multiplied in nature and back inside of me so that I can see and feel that is not the feeling I want to have. I might not know the one I want, but I know I don't want this one. If I'm conscious and I separate from that and hold a space with my awareness. The trouble is, we forget that we should be doing this. We forget because another thing comes and another thing comes and we go back to sleep. So the harmony of the octave actually puts us back to sleep because I forget what it is I'm trying to accomplish in this moment. So holding an aim or a purpose to be conscious, or at least to not identify, or at least understanding, calculate that there will be resistance in my life, and the best thing I can do is not identify with it. When I notice my body tensing up, relax. When I notice my voice raising, slow down, breathe, and create a space to see what might arise that I don't suspect. By noticing what arises, which I could have definitely expected. This person called me a name, and I want to call them a name. We want to reveal the unknown, the truth that is unknown from moment to moment, that has the power to free us. But in order to do that, we have to hold a space with our consciousness and be able to understand the potential in the discordance that arises inside of me and not identify with that. The Gnostic Master Samael says that the key is to never identify with the elements of life. Never identify. And you say, but this is really extreme. All the more reason to not identify. Now, this is perfect scenario, but in that extreme situation, it has the power of penetrating deeper into my psyche and bringing more intense vibrations up and out. And if I can hold the space, I'm able to see them. And if I hold the space, I'm able to free myself from them. Because I didn't identify with this, and more so I have to not identify with the reaction inside of me. And in that way, we transcend this, what is called the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Confusion, which for us seems like normalcy because I keep doing the same things that I want to do and I don't get the result. The Master Gurdjieff said that the highest prayer that an individual can have is that 2 + 2 = 5. And the only way that I can do that is to not take circumstances in life the same, noticing what comes up and keeping space so that potential, so contrast could be understood, so that the mathematical value between two vibrations can, in that space, harmonize my psyche. Because this loop continues. I create a concept, and from my concept of myself, I have a thought. That thought produces a feeling which drives me to act. But when I do it unconsciously, it's not an action, it's a reaction. I become the discordant note in relationship to this note. Or I become the harmonious note in relation to this note that I don't wish to synchronize with. And that rhythm, like the rave drum beat, just puts me to sleep, and I'm just become a robot. Doing the things that Paul in the Gospels talks about, doing the wrong that I do not wish to do. I'm not capable of doing the good that I wish to do. But I have the capacity to perceive that. And if I can perceive it, then I have a choice. Other than that, I don't have a choice. I think I have a choice, but I actually don't. Because what happens is this relationship of the octave becomes do, re, mi. Nature gets it going because everything has a creation and everything has 3 parts in a creation. But that's all nature needs. It doesn't need you to wake up. It doesn't want you to wake up. That want has to come from inside of ourselves by first realizing that I'm asleep. Not by the world's asleep, or this president isn't in congruency with what I want, or the world is going to Hades. But by realizing those attachments to those elements are vibrating inside of me that produce hatred. Hatred against hatred is still hatred. But we feel justified and righteous by that. So we see something terrible and disgusting, and so we feel something terrible and disgusting about it, and we feel that we're doing the right thing. But we're just becoming identified and perpetuating sleep. And so what happens is, continually, do, re, mi, do, re, mi. The octave does never get to the 4th note, and it comes back. And this is one of the complicated reasons why history repeats itself, why I do the same things over and over. why I mean to do something good and I end up doing the opposite. Because I'm psychologically attached to something that I'm not aware of. And perpetuates this disharmony. So we're going to end there. I'm just going to show you Om. The vibration of Om. And look up the message of water, the hidden message in water, because that's very wonderful. What we're going to conclude with is one more musical practice. In the words of Ludwig van Beethoven, who is a high master of music that has a relationship in the superior dimensions of the music of the spheres, he said that music is the mediator between the spiritual and the sensual life. So we're going to listen to some music. We'll stretch for a moment. We're approaching 9 o'clock. The practice is going to be about 16, 17, 18 minutes. So if you want to stay for that, you can. We're going to start like very quickly, so it won't be too long. We're going to listen to some modern music played on strings. It's a love song and a fear of being in love. It's a song that it's one of the things I like to do is listen to modern music played on an old instruments. Very beautiful. So we'll listen to that song, and then we're going to hear some of the psychological music of Beethoven, just some very short sonatas that we're probably very familiar with, and we're going to try to listen with our heart, but not listen as much with our heart, but allow our heart to be open as if the music is coming through our heart and holding the space. And then we're going to play one of the first, and here's a vision of it. One of the earliest noted music compositions, and it was found in the Oracle of Delphi. There was 2 songs written there, and they were hymns to Apollo. So we're going to listen to one of the hymns to Apollo that was used in the ancient Greek festivals, and then we're going to conclude with another spiritually uplifting song. So.